On the 32nd floor of Blackwell Capital, in front of dozens of employees and the entire executive committee, Claire Blackwell mocked Logan Hayes, a senior analyst and a single father. For one reason only, he left the office on time. She let the silence stretch, then delivered 4 words that everyone in the room heard clearly. "Quit if you dare." Logan did not argue or defend himself. He cleared his desk, returned his badge, and walked out that same afternoon. Nobody in that building understood that the person who would regret it most was not him. Logan Hayes arrived at Blackwell Capital every morning at 7:15, before the automatic lights on the 32nd floor finished waking up. He kept his desk clear, his files labeled by date, and his coffee in the same white cup he had used for 11 years. At 36, he had a reputation in the building that came down to one thing. When Logan Hayes signed his name at the bottom of a valuation, the number above it was correct. He had been there since the firm was small enough that everyone knew the man who ran it. Arthur Blackwell had built the place on a rule he repeated in every meeting until it stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like the floor under everyone's feet. Get the number right first. Decide what to do about it second. Arthur had been dead for 2 years, and the rule had died somewhere in the same period more quietly. There was one fixed point in Logan's day. At 6 o'clock, he closed his laptop, put on his coat, and left. He did not linger at the elevator bank. He did not take a call in the lobby, and he did not apologize to anyone for the door closing behind him. He was a single father, and the obligation waiting for him at home did not move for markets for clients or for anyone's calendar. The rest of the day belonged to the firm. 6 o'clock did not. For 9 years, nobody had cared. Arthur had never once asked what time Logan left, because Arthur had read what Logan produced. The work arrived early, it arrived complete, and twice it had kept the firm out of transactions that later collapsed on somebody else's balance sheet. In that building at that time, output was the only currency anyone bothered to count. Claire Blackwell took over 6 months after her father's funeral. She was 31. She had a hard, clean way of speaking, and she moved through the office like someone who had been told her entire life that she would have to be twice as certain as everyone else in the room. She had inherited a controlling interest worth more than $1 billion and a board that had known her since she was a teenager, and both facts followed her into every meeting she ran. She rebuilt the 32nd floor within a month, glass walls where there had been offices, her own desk positioned so that she could see the whole floor without turning her head. What she wanted was visible, and she never said it directly, but the building understood it anyway. She intended to be the person who had earned the chair rather than the person who had been handed it, and she intended everyone to watch her do it. The culture changed faster than the furniture. Dinner started arriving at 8, then at 9. Presence became the measurement because presence was visible and analysis was not. In performance reviews, people who stayed until midnight were described as committed. People who finished early were described as comfortable. Nobody said the word out loud, but everyone learned it. The building rewarded the ones who were still inside it. Claire noticed Logan in her 2nd month. Not his work at first, his coat. She was standing at the glass on a Thursday evening watching her floor, and at exactly 6 o'clock, a man on the east side stood up, put on a gray coat, and walked to the elevator, while 30 other people stayed seated. She asked her assistant who he was, and she was told that he was the best analyst in the building. The answer did not settle anything for her. It made it worse. She began to mention it in meetings lightly at first, the way people do when they want an idea in the room without owning it. She would look at the clock during a 5:30 session and say that she knew some of them had places to be. She never used his name. Everyone at the table looked at the same person anyway. Marcus Reed sat 2 desks down from Logan and had been at the firm nearly as long. He was the kind of man who read the weather in an organization before anyone else felt the wind change, and he had been reading it for months. One evening, he stopped Logan on the way to the elevator and told him he should think about staying late a few times a week. Not for the work, for the optics. Logan told him the work was the optics. He said it without heat the way he said most things, and he pressed the button for the lobby. Marcus stood there and watched the doors close and understood that his friend had just chosen a very specific kind of ending for himself and did not know it yet. In March, 18 months into Claire's tenure, the Meridian Harbor portfolio landed on Logan's desk. It came through Diane Kessler, who ran compliance and had survived the transition by making herself impossible to blame. She set the file down and said that Claire wanted the diligence completed in 3 weeks and that Claire wanted it clean. Logan asked what clean meant. Diane looked at him for a moment and told him it meant finished on schedule, and then she left before he could ask the second question. The portfolio was 9 commercial properties across 2 states, packaged and sold by a developer named Victor Ashford, and the price was $400 million. It was the largest single acquisition the firm had attempted since Arthur's death, and everyone on the floor understood what it meant. Claire had inherited a company. This would be the first thing inside it that was hers. The board had approved the exploration. The announcement had already been drafted. The first pass looked good. The rent rolls were strong. The occupancy figures sat in the low 90s, and the projected yield was 2 points above anything comparable on the market. All of it arrived through a single reporting platform that Ashford's organization owned and operated, which was standard in transactions of that size, and which Logan noted in his working file without comment. He spent 4 days confirming what was in front of him and found nothing wrong. On the 5th day, he pulled the tenant list for the 3rd property, a distribution center outside Harrisburg, and something in the column widths bothered him. 3 of the largest tenants had signed within the same 2-week window, all at rents well above the local average, all on 10-year terms. He looked up their corporate registrations. 2 had been incorporated 4 months before the leases were signed. The 3rd had a registered address that matched a mailbox service. None of them had a website, a filing history, or a single employee he could locate. He kept going. Property 6 carried the same pattern under different names. Property 8 had a tenant that existed on paper and appeared on the Ashford summary as paying rent every month. Logan built a second model from primary records, only ignoring everything the seller's platform had generated, and the number underneath began to appear. It took 19 days. He pulled county filings, utility hookups, and municipal inspection records. He drove out to 2 of the sites on a Saturday and stood in parking lots that should have held 400 vehicles and held 9. Then he did the thing that broke it open, which was to bypass Ashford's platform entirely and request the collection statements directly from the local property managers who operated the buildings on the ground. They had never been told not to send them, so they sent them. The local statements did not match the platform. At the Harrisburg property, 3 tenants had never transmitted a payment through any account the on-site manager controlled. The rent existed in Ashford's system and nowhere else in the physical world. Logan did all of it, and he still left at 6 o'clock every day. He worked at his kitchen table at night after his obligation at home was met with the county documents, spread across the wood, and the lamp on until 2 in the morning. Nobody at the firm ever saw those hours. That was the part they measured, and it was the only part that was invisible. Marcus found him at his desk on a Wednesday with 3 screens open and asked what he had. Logan told him. The occupancy was not in the low 90s, it was closer to 60. The leases propping up the valuation had been written between related parties to manufacture income that did not exist. The cash flow in the model had never been collected by anyone. Marcus asked how far off the price was. Logan told him the portfolio was worth somewhere near $310 million and that Blackwell Capital was preparing to pay $400 million for it. $90 million of the purchase price was buying nothing at all. Beyond the money, the structure was not sloppy work. It was built. Somebody had written those leases on purpose. That was the part Marcus reacted to. He sat down on the edge of the desk and told Logan to hand it to Diane. Let compliance carry it and keep his name off the front page. Logan said compliance would send it straight back to the executive committee, and the executive committee was Claire. There was no version of this where the report arrived without a name attached to it. He tried Diane anyway. She read the summary in her office with the door closed and did not argue with a single figure. Then she told him that the deal carried a board expectation, that the announcement was already scheduled, and that compliance would support a formal finding only if the executive committee requested one. She said she was sorry. Logan believed that she was, and believed it would not matter. He wrote the report himself over the next 4 days. 141 pages. Every claim sourced to a primary document. Every document attached. Every assumption stated in plain language. He wrote it the way Arthur had taught him, without adjectives and without a recommendation in the opening section, so that nobody could accuse him of arriving with a conclusion and reverse engineering the evidence toward it. The night before the meeting, he printed 12 copies and stacked them in his bag. He knew what he was carrying. He was not naive about the room he was walking into, and he had spent enough of the past month watching the floor to understand exactly how it had changed. He also understood that the number was correct, and that the number was the only thing he actually controlled. The meeting was called for 4 o'clock on a Thursday in the main conference room, the one with the glass wall facing the floor. Claire had ordered that wall built so the firm could see its leadership working. It also meant the firm could see everything that happened inside it. 12 people took seats at the table. Perhaps 40 more were at their desks outside, close enough to watch, close enough to hear if a voice was raised. Gregory Sloan, the chief operating officer, opened with the transaction timeline and confirmed that signing was set for the following Tuesday. Howard Whitfield, the senior board representative, sat at the far end with his hands folded, saying nothing, which was what Howard Whitfield did in every meeting, until the moment it became expensive not to. Claire sat at the head of the table and asked whether diligence was closed. Logan said it was not, and put the copies on the table. He presented for 10 minutes. He did not raise his voice, and he did not editorialize. He walked them through the incorporation dates, the mailbox address, the parking lots, and the gap between Ashford's platform and the statements from the managers who actually operated the buildings. He put the 2 models side by side, the sellers and the one built from primary records, and showed them the $90 million space between them. When he finished, the room was quiet, in a way that told him people had understood. Gregory Sloan was looking down at page 31. Diane Kessler was not looking up at all. 2 of the junior directors had turned their copies to the appendix. Outside the glass, the floor had noticed that nobody inside was talking, and heads were coming up over the monitors. Claire had not opened her copy. She said that the transaction had already been reviewed by 2 outside firms and a legal team, and asked whether Logan believed all of them had missed something that he alone had found. Logan said they had reviewed the documents the seller provided, and that he had reviewed the documents the seller did not. He offered to walk her through any single property she chose in any order she wanted. She did not choose one. Instead, she asked how long he had been working on this, and when he told her, she said that 3 weeks of a man's time had produced a document designed to stop the firm from doing the one thing it had been preparing for all year. She used the word obstruction, and once it was in the room, the meeting stopped being about Meridian Harbor. She said she had noticed a pattern, that there were people in this building who wanted the firm to stand still because standing still was easier than growing. That some of them dressed it up as caution. That caution was a very comfortable thing to hide behind, particularly for people who were not prepared to give very much. Then she looked at the clock on the wall, which read 5:51, and asked the room whether anyone had noticed that Mr. Hayes had never once been in this building after 6 o'clock. Nobody answered her. She did not need them to. She said that she ran a firm where people gave everything they had, that she had watched them do it for 18 months, and that she found it remarkable that the one man who packed up at 6 every night believed he was qualified to walk in here and tell her how to run her father's company. She said that a person unwilling to sacrifice for the work had not earned the right to be trusted about the work. The glass wall meant the floor heard all of it. Logan did not defend himself. He did not explain what waited for him at home, and he did not mention the nights at the kitchen table with the county records spread out under the lamp. He said one thing, and he said it evenly. He told her the report was accurate, that every page was sourced, and that she should read it before Tuesday. Claire told him that if he had a problem with how the firm operated, he was welcome to find a firm that operated differently. He said nothing. She leaned back in her chair and delivered it to the whole room. "Quit if you dare." He stood up. That was the only answer he gave her. He walked out of the conference room, and 40 people watched him cross the floor to his desk and start emptying it. There was not much. A photograph he turned face down before he set it in the box. 2 reference books. The White Cup. 11 years of a career fit into a container he could carry under one arm. Marcus came over and asked quietly whether he was sure. Logan said she had made the offer in front of the entire company and that he was not going to make her repeat it. He put the last folder in the box, closed the flaps, and did not look back toward the conference room, where Claire was still seated and had still not opened her copy. He walked to the front desk, took his badge off the lanyard, and set it on the counter. The woman there did not know what to say to him, so she said nothing. He picked up the box, took the elevator down 32 floors, and stepped out onto the street. It was 6 o'clock exactly. He was, as always, on time. The box sat in the trunk of his car for 3 days before he brought it inside. Logan had 11 years of savings and a mortgage he had refinanced 2 summers earlier, and when he ran the arithmetic at the kitchen table, where he had built the second Meridian Harbor model, the number came out to 7 months. 7 months of the house, the utilities, the insurance, and the obligation at home that had never once moved for anybody. After that, there was nothing behind him. What he had lost was not only the salary. For 11 years, every call he made had opened with the name of a firm that managed billions, and doors had opened because of the name, rather than the man attached to it. That was gone in a single afternoon. He was a man with a spreadsheet and no letterhead, and he understood inside the first week how much of his professional weight had been borrowed rather than owned. He made 12 calls in 9 days to people he had known for a decade. 4 were never returned. The ones that were had the same shape. They were glad to hear from him they had heard something about a disagreement at Blackwell, and unfortunately nothing was open at his level right now. One managing director was honest enough to say the rest of it out loud. The story circulating was that Logan Hayes had blown up a $400 million transaction out of ego and had been asked to leave. Nobody had put that in writing or said it to a regulator. It had simply moved through the industry the way things move in industries at lunches and on golf courses, and it did not need to be true to be effective. Claire Blackwell had never needed to blacklist him. She only needed to be the last employer on his resume, and the one whose version of events was told first. On the following Tuesday, exactly as scheduled, Blackwell Capital signed the Meridian Harbor acquisition. Logan learned about it from a press release he read on his phone in a parking lot. $400 million, 9 properties across 2 states, described as a transformative expansion of the firm's commercial real estate platform. Ashford was quoted saying he was pleased to have found a partner with the vision to move quickly. Logan read it twice, put the phone face down on the passenger seat, and drove home. He gave himself 2 more weeks of calling people. When the second week produced nothing, he stopped because he could see the pattern, and he was not in a position to spend 7 months learning it slowly. If no institution would hire a man who had refused to sign a bad number, then the only remaining option was to build something where refusing to sign a bad number was the product itself. He registered Hayes' advisory group in the last week of April. It cost $430 in filing fees and existed entirely on the second floor of his house, in a room with one desk, 2 monitors, and a printer he had bought used. He kept his license's current secured errors and omissions coverage that consumed more of his savings than he had budgeted, and built a website over a weekend that looked exactly like what it was. The pitch ran 4 sentences. Independent valuation and transaction diligence. No brokerage arm, no advisory fee tied to whether a deal closes, no relationship with any seller. He would tell a client what an asset was worth, and the fee would be identical whether the answer made them happy or not. He put that last line on the front page because it was the only genuine difference between him and every other firm in the market. The first 6 weeks produced nothing. He was turned down 14 times, and the rejections were educational in a way the job search had not been. Middle market funds told him they liked the concept, but could not put a $200 million decision in the hands of a company with 1 employee. A family office in Delaware went 3 meetings deep and then went quiet, and a week later he learned they had hired a national firm because their bank was more comfortable with the name. By the second week of June, he had spent 2 months of the 7 and had earned nothing. He did not tell anyone that, including Marcus, because there was no version of saying it that would have produced a client. The call came in mid-June from a man named Raymond Pierce, who ran a mid-sized industrial fund out of Pittsburgh and had heard about Logan through a property manager in Harrisburg, of all places. Pierce was under contract on a 7-property portfolio and had a bad feeling about the rent rolls that he could not put into language his own analysts would accept. He wanted a second opinion inside 3 weeks, and he said plainly that his budget was $110,000, which was less than a firm of any size would take. Logan took it. He worked the way he had worked on Meridian Harbor from primary records outward, ignoring everything the seller had packaged, and on day 16, he found that 3 of the 7 properties carried deferred structural obligations that had never appeared in the disclosure. Not fraud. Ordinary omission worth about $18 million. He wrote it up in 62 pages, sourced every claim, and delivered on schedule. Pierce used the report to reprice the deal and closed at $18 million below the original contract. He paid the invoice in 4 days and then did something more valuable. He told half a dozen other people. In a market where every consultant has an incentive buried somewhere in the transaction, a man who took a fee and then handed over a document that cost his client nothing to walk away from was a story worth repeating. By August, Logan had 4 clients. By October, he had 8 and had leased 1,200 square feet of office space above a title company because taking meetings in his own house had stopped being defensible. He hired an associate, then a second. The work arrived the way it does when a reputation begins to compound through people who had used him once and would not use anyone else again. Marcus Reed called in November. He had stayed at Blackwell after Logan left and had spent 8 months watching the 32nd floor become something he no longer recognized. He told Logan the culture had hardened rather than settled, that the review cycle now openly rewarded hours logged, and that 4 analysts he had trained had left in a single quarter. Then he said the sentence that mattered, which was that he had stopped being able to say what he actually thought in meetings. He asked whether there was room. Logan told him there was, and that he could not match his Blackwell compensation, and Marcus took it anyway. 2 others followed him out of the building within 5 months, both of them people who had been in the conference room that Thursday and had watched a man carry a box to the elevator without raising his voice. They had spent the intervening year deciding what that meant. What formed above the title company was not simply a competitor. It was a different answer to the same question. Blackwell Capital had become an organization that measured devotion by presence and treated caution as a character flaw. Hayes' advisory group ran on the rule Arthur Blackwell had repeated for 30 years before his daughter buried him, and Logan never said it out loud to anyone, including Marcus. Marcus recognized it inside the first week regardless. The conflict had stopped being between an employee and a chief executive. It had become a test running in public between two ideas about what a firm is for. Claire did not see it that way. She heard the name Hayes Advisory Group twice that year, once when a prospective client mentioned it, and once when Diane Kessler raised it in a staffing conversation about attrition. Her reaction was the same on both occasions. She said a man who had built a career carrying other people's models did not become a firm because he printed business cards, and that a boutique with 3 employees was not a development, it was a hobby. She believed it. From the 32nd floor, with $400 million of new assets on the books and a press cycle that had been generous 1,200 square feet above a title company in a suburb, did not register as anything at all. It was the same error she had already made once in a conference room in March, when she had judged the size of a man by the size of the room he was standing in. Meridian Harbor performed. That was the part Logan had not expected and had no defense against. In its first 2 quarters under Blackwell ownership, the portfolio reported income within 4% of the acquisition model. Rent showed as collected. Occupancy showed in the low 90s. The industry press ran a profile in September under a headline calling Claire Blackwell the most decisive capital allocator of her generation, and the piece opened with the observation that she had closed a complex transaction in under 90 days. Every one of those figures came off the platform Ashford's organization owned, which Blackwell had retained after closing, because retaining it had been a condition of the deal. Logan understood exactly what that meant. Ashford had not sold a fraud and walked away. He had sold a fraud and kept his hands on the instrument that reported whether it was working. Understanding it and being able to say it were 2 entirely different things, and Logan had no standing to say anything to anyone. He was a former employee with a grievance running a small firm that competed for the same clients. Any statement he made would be read as exactly that, and he knew it. He had a complete source document and no legitimate audience for it. The report sat on an encrypted drive in his office and in 12 printed copies distributed to people who had chosen not to open them. What circulated instead was his reputation for being wrong. The Meridian Harbor story had a satisfying shape, and shape travels faster than accuracy. There had been an analyst who tried to kill the biggest deal in the firm's history, who was so certain of himself that he walked out over it, and who had been proven wrong within 6 months by the performance of the asset. A managing director at a competing firm repeated it at an industry dinner in November, describing Logan as a cautionary example of a technician who mistook thoroughness for judgment. Marcus heard that one secondhand and brought it into the office the next morning, angry, in a way Logan had not seen from him before. He wanted to release the file. He argued that they could send the primary documents to 2 reporters and let the county records speak without a word of commentary from Hayes Advisory Group. Logan told him no. The moment their name was attached to it, the story became a fired analyst attacking a former employer, and the documents would stop being evidence and start being motive. He said one more thing, which Marcus repeated to himself many times afterward. If the numbers are wrong, the numbers eventually say so themselves. Nobody has to help them. So Logan watched. Through the fall, through the winter, while the portfolio reported income it was not earning, and Blackwell Capital raised a new fund on the strength of a track record that included it. He read the quarterly disclosures the way other people read the weather. He never contacted a regulator, never spoke to a journalist, and never mentioned Meridian Harbor to a client. He built his firm, and he left the office at 6 o'clock. And he waited for arithmetic to do the only thing arithmetic reliably does. It took 11 months from the afternoon he carried the box out of the building. The trigger was ordinary. A lender holding debt on 2 of the 9 properties ordered a routine reappraisal ahead of a refinancing in February, and the appraiser physically inspected the Harrisburg Distribution Center. He counted the vehicles in a lot built for 400 and found fewer than a dozen. He walked the interior and found 60% of the leased square footage empty and unimproved, with no evidence any tenant had ever occupied it. The appraisal came back at a value that could not be reconciled with the reported income under any assumption, and the lender did what lenders do when a number cannot be reconciled. It halted the refinancing and referred the file. Within 6 weeks, a state securities regulator had opened an inquiry into how a portfolio generating that income statement could be sitting 60% vacant, and the inquiry ran straight at the leases. They found what Logan had found in 19 days from a kitchen table. The anchor tenants at the Harrisburg property had been incorporated 4 months before signing 10-year leases at rents no comparable tenant in that market had ever paid. One registered address was a mailbox service, the same pattern repeated at properties 6 and 8. Through 2 intermediate holding companies, every one of those entities traced back to Victor Ashford. He had leased the buildings to himself, reported the rent as collected on a platform he controlled, and sold the resulting income stream for $400 million. Blackwell Capital had not merely overpaid. It had bought an asset built to be overpaid for, retained the seller's reporting system after closing, and marketed a new fund using the fabricated performance. That last part converted a bad investment into a legal problem because the numbers had gone into materials investors relied upon. The firm came apart inside a single quarter. 2 of the largest institutional investors in the new fund filed notice of withdrawal. The auditors declined to sign off on the prior year without a restatement. Gregory Sloan resigned as chief operating officer on a Friday and had his office cleared by Monday, and 2 senior directors followed him within the month. Diane Kessler, who had read the summary behind a closed door and said she was sorry, was placed on administrative leave pending a review of what compliance had known and when. Howard Whitfield became extremely audible. He informed the board that the transaction had proceeded without a completed diligence finding, and he requested the file. The file was where it had been for 11 months. Diane's assistant located the executive committee copies in a storage cabinet on the 32nd floor, still stacked in the order they had been left on the table in March. 10 of the 12 had never been opened. Claire's copy was on top. She read it that night alone in the conference room with the glass wall and the floor dark on the other side of it. Every claim sourced to a primary document. The incorporation dates, the mailbox address, the photographs from a parking lot on a Saturday, the 2 models side by side, the sellers, and the real one, and the gap between them stated without a single adjective attached to it. He had brought her all of it before she signed. She had told the room he was obstructing her. She had counted the hours he did not spend in the building and decided that was the measurement that mattered, and she had made that decision in front of 40 people who were now going to be asked what they saw. By the time she finished the last page, it was long past midnight, and there was nothing left in the document that could be used to save anything. The inquiry that began with a parking lot in Harrisburg did not stay in Pennsylvania. Federal prosecutors opened a parallel investigation in the summer, and by December, a grand jury had returned an indictment against Victor Ashford on 7 counts related to the fabrication of leases and the sale of an income stream that had never existed. He surrendered on a Tuesday morning, and the photograph of him walking into the courthouse ran alongside every subsequent story about the transaction, which meant it ran alongside the name Blackwell Capital. The firm was not accused of building the fraud. It was accused of something that read worse in a headline, which was buying it with its eyes open. Investigators had the diligence file within days of Whitfield requesting it, and the file described the entire scheme in sourced detail, dated the same afternoon the executive committee approved the purchase. 10 of the 12 copies had never been opened. That detail appeared in the second paragraph of nearly every article written about the matter. What made it unrecoverable was not the $90 million. It was the 11 months that followed, during which Blackwell Capital had marketed a new fund using performance figures generated by a system the seller still controlled. Investors had relied on those numbers. 2 of them filed suit that spring, and the complaint attached the March report as an exhibit because the report established that the firm had been told exactly what it was buying before it bought it. The civil discovery ran into a second year. Depositions lasted 8 hours at a stretch, conducted by attorneys who had read every page of the file and every calendar entry from that week. They asked Claire what she had done with the report. She answered that she had received it. They asked whether she had read it before closing, and there was no version of the answer that helped her, so she gave the accurate one. Then they asked about the meeting. 40 people had been on the floor with a glass wall between them and the conference room, and 14 of them had already described what they heard. The words entered the record in the flat, indifferent way words do in transcripts without the room around them, and without the clock reading 5:51. Counsel asked whether she had said, "Quit if you dare," to the author of the report in front of her employees, in a meeting convened to evaluate the transaction. She said that she had. The board hearing came that August. Whitfield ran it, walking the room through the timeline with the patience of a man who had spent 2 years deciding how he would eventually describe his own silence, and had concluded that describing someone else's failure loudly was the most efficient method available. 2 shareholder groups appeared with prepared statements. They did not dwell on the loss because losses were understood to be part of the business. They focused on the process. A senior analyst had produced a complete sourced finding, had presented it to the executive committee, and had been removed from the building the same afternoon. Every risk control the firm advertised to its investors had functioned exactly as designed, and then a single person had overridden all of them. Claire had no defense that was not an explanation, and she understood that explanations are what people offer once they have already lost. She had believed the deal was the thing that would prove the company was hers rather than her father's, and she had treated every obstacle to it as a challenge to her authority instead of as information. She did not say that in the hearing. She said the responsibility was hers, that she had not read the report. And she sat down. The board removed her as chief executive that September and left her on the board as a non-executive director, which was structure rather than mercy. Removing her entirely would have signaled that the family had abandoned the firm, and the firm was already selling assets to fund settlements. She kept her name on the building and lost every function it had ever performed. While that was happening in one city, Logan Hayes was in another, and his year was not simple either. Hayes' advisory group had reached 9 people, and the work was steady, but all of it was middle market. Portfolios in the $50 to $200 million range funds that could not afford a national firm and were glad to find someone thorough. It was a real business that paid real salaries, and it was also, as Marcus pointed out over a table covered with engagement letters, that spring a business that had never once been trusted with something large enough to be dangerous. The opportunity arrived in April, 3 weeks after the state inquiry became public. The Carrington Retirement System, which managed pension assets for roughly 90,000 public employees, was preparing to commit $600 million to a portfolio of industrial and logistics assets. Its chief investment officer, a woman named Catherine Doyle, wanted an independent valuation performed by someone with no relationship to the sponsor, the broker, or the lender. She called Logan because his name had begun appearing in a context he had never sought. Coverage of the Ashford indictment mentioned an analyst who had documented the fraud before it closed, and within weeks that analyst had been identified. Doyle was direct about it in the first meeting. She said she had 2 problems with hiring him, and she intended to raise both before he said anything at all. The first was size. His firm had 9 people and a lease above a title company. Carrington's own board would ask reasonably whether a $600 million decision belonged with an organization that small, and whether he carried enough coverage to matter if he were wrong. The second problem was worse. She said the entire industry now knew him as the man who had been right about Blackwell, and that being famous for one correct call was the least reliable qualification in finance. Logan did not argue with either point. He told her the size was accurate and that she should verify his coverage limits herself. On the second, he said, Meridian Harbor had not required judgment, and that anyone would have found it who read the county records instead of the seller's package. The only thing he could offer her was that his fee would be identical, whether he told her the portfolio was worth more than the price or less, and she was free to write that into the engagement letter. She wrote it in. The engagement ran 10 weeks, and the firm put 6 of its 9 people on it. They pulled primary records on every property, ordered independent inspections at 12 of the 20 sites, and rebuilt the income model without using a single figure supplied by the sponsor. Marcus ran the lease-level work himself because he had spent a year at Blackwell learning what a manufactured lease looked like from the wrong side of the table. What they found was that the portfolio was sound. That was the part Logan had not anticipated, and the part that turned out to matter most. 3 properties carried deferred capital obligations that had been disclosed but understated, worth about $14 million in aggregate. Everything else held. The occupancy was real. The tenants were operating companies with employees and utility accounts, and the income was collected by a manager with no ownership relationship to the seller. He delivered a report recommending the transaction proceed at a price reduced by $14 million, and it landed differently than anything he had produced before. In the months since the inquiry became public, a version of Logan Hayes had formed in the market that he had never encouraged. He was the man who killed deals. He was the professional skeptic, useful in the way a smoke alarm is useful, valuable mainly for saying no. The Carrington report ended that. It demonstrated that he was not opposed to transactions. He was opposed to inaccurate numbers, and that when the number was correct, he said so with the same absence of drama. Doyle presented the finding to her board in July, closed the deal in August, and told the story at 4 separate industry functions before the end of the year. Institutional money is conservative in a particular way. It does not follow performance. It follows whoever another institution has already trusted with something it could not afford to lose. By the following spring, Hayes Advisory Group had 31 employees and 4 floors of a building that no longer sat above a title company. 2 more people came over from Blackwell in that period, including a valuation director who had spent the Meridian Harbor year producing quarterly figures she had never been permitted to question. The firm turned away work for the first time because Logan refused any engagement where the client had already selected the conclusion. He kept the fee structure. He kept the rule that no member of the firm could hold an interest in any asset they valued. He also kept one other thing which new employees noticed inside their first month and asked Marcus about privately because they assumed it was a joke. At 6 o'clock, Logan Hayes closed his laptop, put on his coat, and left. He did not stay for the last hour of a model build. He did not take a call in the parking lot, and he never once asked anyone else in the building to stay either. Marcus told them what he had told the last 4 people who asked. The man had been mocked in front of an entire company for exactly that, had lost 11 years of his career over it, and had rebuilt a firm larger than the one that fired him without moving the hour by a single minute. Nobody asked twice. The award came that October. The National Association of Investment Professionals gave an annual honor for ethics and leadership, ordinarily a quiet thing presented at a hotel ballroom dinner, to 800 people who were mostly there for the networking. That year, it was not quiet, because the citation described a diligence finding delivered before a $400 million transaction and left unread in a storage cabinet, and because everyone in the room already knew both halves of the story and the 11 months between them. Claire Blackwell attended. She still held a board seat, and board seats came with tables at events like that one, and counsel had advised that visible participation in the industry was preferable to disappearance. She sat near the back with two people from a firm that had bought part of Blackwell's remaining portfolio, and she watched a man she had once called unqualified to advise her walk to the front of a room that stood up for him. He spoke for less than 3 minutes. He thanked the association. He thanked the 31 people who worked at his firm, and he said the only meaningful part of the job was that the number you produced had to be the number regardless of who was paying for it, and regardless of what they had already decided. He did not mention Blackwell Capital. He did not mention Meridian Harbor, or a conference room with a glass wall, or 4 words spoken at 5:51 on a Thursday afternoon in March. That was the part Claire understood while she sat there with a plate in front of her she had not touched. He had never used it. Not once had he given a quote, released the file, or spoken to a journalist about her, and he had turned down every opportunity to be the wronged man in someone else's story. Everything that destroyed her had been assembled out of documents and witnesses she had produced herself. She had spent the deposition years believing her failure was financial, that she had made an expensive misjudgment about an asset and been punished proportionally. Sitting in that ballroom, she saw the shape of it correctly. Firms lost $90 million and continued. What she had not survived was the transcript and the 14 employees who repeated the same 4 words, and the simple fact that she had told the one accurate person in her building to quit if he dared, and had never opened his file. The money had cost her the deal. The sentence had cost her everything the deal was meant to prove. She did not approach him. She left before the dinner ended. Whitfield approached him instead 4 months later in February. The board had finished its restructuring and was rebuilding the risk function from nothing, and he came to the offices personally with an offer that was by any external measure remarkable. Chief Risk Officer of Blackwell Capital reporting to the board rather than to management with authority to halt any transaction and compensation well beyond what the role had ever carried. He framed it as a correction, the firm returning to the man it should have listened to. Logan declined in the same meeting. He was not sharp about it, and he took no pleasure in it. He told Whitfield the failure had never been the absence of a chief risk officer, because the firm had possessed every control it needed in March, and had used none of them. The problem was that one person decided a report was an insult rather than information, and no title handed to a returning employee would have changed that. A structure only works when the people inside it want to know what is true, and he had built a place where that was the entire product. Whitfield asked whether any arrangement would interest him. Logan told him there was not, thanked him for coming, and walked him to the elevator. He never mentioned the offer to anyone at his firm, and Marcus learned of it 2 years later from someone on the Blackwell side. Diane Kessler wrote to him that spring. The compliance review had cleared her of concealment and found only that she had failed to escalate, which ended her career at Blackwell without ending it anywhere else. She did not ask him for a position, and she did not ask for absolution. She wrote that she had read his summary behind a closed door and had understood every figure in it, and that she had chosen the schedule over the number. Logan answered in 4 lines, thanked her for writing, and did not offer her a job. He had built the firm specifically so that nobody inside it would ever have to make that choice, and hiring her would have meant pretending the choice had not been made. He never pursued Claire Blackwell either. He produced the report to investigators when it was subpoenaed, answered every question he was asked under oath, and confined himself to what was in the documents. When plaintiff's counsel invited him to characterize her conduct, he declined and described only what he had presented and on what date. He was not protecting her. He had decided on the afternoon he carried a box across the 32nd floor that the argument was finished, and he never reopened it. She spent the following years watching consequences arrive on their own schedule. Her name stayed on a building whose assets were being sold, and she attended board meetings where her presence was tolerated as a matter of appearances. She had inherited a company built on a rule her father repeated for 30 years and had thrown the rule out while keeping the furniture because the rule was invisible and the furniture was not. Logan Hayes built the rest of his career on that rule without ever saying it out loud. His firm eventually employed more than 80 people and reviewed transactions in 16 states, and its reputation rested on one characteristic, which was that its reports read the same whether the client wanted them to or not. He still left at 6 o'clock,